One thing Silksong excels at as a game is its balancing. As fantastic of a game Hollow Knight was, there was one set of objectively strong charms that most players were funneled into at the end of the day. One god build, if you will. Silksong, for the most part, doesn't quite have this. There's an impressive variety of crest and tool combinations that can be viable for optimized gameplay. In Silksong's 100% speedrun, 5 out of 7 of the game's crests get moments of proper use throughout the run. Even the Beast Crest gets an impressive show in between the Beast Chapel and the nearest bench. Well, almost. Silksong has one outlier. One extremely powerful tool whose storied history I think exemplifies and showcases in microcosm all of the discovery, practice, technique, and theory crafting that goes into making a speedrun. And one that, much like its predecessor, released in such an insanely broken state that it threatened to upend Silksong's most popular speedrun altogether. It's quite a story. Optimizing a speedrun is one huge puzzle, so let's solve it together. In today's case, the jigsaw pieces are shaped a little bit like this. We need to talk about the sawtooth circlet. The sawtooth circlet is an offensive blue tool that activates a horizontal spike around Hornet when she unfurls her drifter's cloak or double jumps. Purchased from the 12th Architect in the Underworks for a price of 230 rosaries and a craft medal, the circlet found itself in an interesting position upon the release of the game. It was a great tool. Really good, in fact. Dealing an impressive 28 damage. Wait, 14 damage. Wait, 9 damage? Wait, 17? Huh, that's odd. Anyway, as it was a bit of an awkward playstyle adjustment and had an annoying tendency to mess up your assorted bilewater platforms, silk spools, etc., most runners, myself included, had neglected it in their casual playthroughs, and therefore failed to even consider it during the initial wave of speedrunning, opting instead to develop a bare-bones, barely upgraded route that became the early Mist and Bells any% routes. About a week or two after release, though, a few runners started raising the point of circlet strength, largely screaming into the void, lost in the stream of hundreds of people making their various contributions to the knowledge pool. As early as September 11th, 2025, exactly 1 week post-launch, a runner by the name of Aoff posted this message.
Yo, sawtooth circlet is broken on Grandmother Silk. Like, it absolutely melts.
Why am I doing this voice? Aoff had discovered something major, but they were way ahead of their time, and it would take weeks for the rest of the community to catch on. So, hold that thought for a bit. And besides, how optimal could it even be to make about a 60-second detour to attain a blue tool that only dished out about 12 damage per activation? No, sorry, 17 damage per activation. Wait. 48 damage? What the hell? The circlet's attack is comprised of a 2-tick burst of damage. The first one, the main tick, dealing 12 damage, and an additional tick dealing 1 damage. I assume just to add some oomph to the animation. Now, here comes the messy part. On the release patch of the game, these values were flat, but they still scaled based on damage multipliers on enemies. In case you didn't know, every single enemy and boss in Silksong has a hidden defense modifier that gets applied to all of Hornet's attacks. Take this big boy, the Coral Clapper. If you reach it with a really low needle or crafting kit upgrade, the game will slap on a hefty 1.5x damage multiplier to make things more fair. Likewise, if you wait to do the forum until you have the 3rd needle upgrade, you'll lose 10% of the damage in your needle. Each enemy has a different stat, and bosses, big enemies, and late game foes are most affected by this. Take this guy. No crafting kits, your Pimpillo deals an additional 40% damage. Full gear, 10% less damage, and so on and so forth. Now, these modifiers are put into place to make the game feel a bit more balanced and to round out the difficulty curve. But on the release of the game, there was a major oversight to it. The needle's base damage would increment with your needle upgrades, and then the modifier would be applied upon that. Similarly, red tools would scale their base damage with crafting kits, and then the modifier would be applied with that. But offensive blue tools? That 13 base damage remained the same regardless of how many crafting kits or needle upgrades you had. It had no base damage scaling. In other words, due to this oversight, the sawtooth circlet actually got exponentially weaker the more upgrades you got for your tools. In the most extreme cases, those being Morwing and the Summoned Savior, the DLC boss, this means that the circlet would deal 26 damage with 0 crafting kits, and only 11 damage with all 4. This is a very plausible explanation for why no one seemed to know exactly how strong the tool was when the game released. Many players had bought it rather late in their playthroughs, where they had a couple crafting kits already, and dismissed it outright, as it was much weaker comparative to their already decked out arsenal. Given that the circlet literally scaled in the opposite direction of all the other upgrades in the game, it had the potential to be extremely overpowered in the early game and absolute garbage in the rest of the game. Well, you can see how the people who had seen the light were so keen to tell other people about it. This scaling would be fixed for later patches, but for this first chapter of the story, this oversight is incredibly important. Put simply, it meant that the circlet was incredibly strong in short, low gear runs. In any percent no major glitches, a run with only one measly needle upgrade, a single trigger of the sawtooth circlet would have the potential to deal comparative damage to a silk spear with 0 silk cost, 0 end lag, and be performable multiple times per second. Absolutely busted, in other words. And lucky for us, given that the earliest possible place in the route to pick up the circlet would be right after Clawline, this meant that you'd be using the tool on the High Hall's Gauntlets, Lace in the Cradle, and Grandmother Silk, 2/3 of which had pretty ridiculous scaling for 0 crafting kits. And that was just the beginning. It gets even crazier. Because on September 23rd, DanL posted this message in the speedrun Discord.
But if you're in the middle of the enemy when you pop circlet, both hitboxes will hit the enemy, causing double damage.
It turned out, Hollow Knight's Silksong had its very own Flukenest. By opening the circlet while in the middle of an enemy with a large hitbox, it was possible to have both sides of the circlet connect with the foe, resulting in the already insane damage being applied twice. This is why all those weeks earlier, Aof had singled out Grandmother Silk as a boss that the circlet was particularly good at. This wasn't just restricted to enemies with big hitboxes either, because speedrunners quickly developed the technique. Even on smaller enemies, it turned out, you could achieve the same effect by simply turning your back to the enemy, activating the circlet, and simultaneously turning to face them. Having the lingering hitbox of both sides of the circlet graze the enemy's hitbox before they disappeared. Now, astute Silksong players will know that this is not normally possible due to the Drifter's Cloak's long turnaround animation. But by swinging your needle right after activating the Drifter's Cloak, you can override the tail end of the float animation and turn around instantly. This also, of course, has the added benefit of adding one freebie in the form of a needle hit added to the combo. So, not only could the Sawtooth Circlet already deal multiple times your needle damage at low crafting kit levels, but every single hit of the Circlet could be doubled. Learn to trigger the cloak often in combat and master the positioning, and you've got this. Pretty cool, right? This absolute godsend for the believers in the circlet route could not have happened at a less opportune time, though. You see, the prospect of including circlet in the bells or mist routes was pretty believable. Route in this choral commandment, plus 60-ish rosaries for the cost, as well as this early craft medal, and pick up the tool from the 12th architect right after getting Clawline. It adds up to about 60 seconds total to pick up the tool, so that's the minimum amount of time that you would have to save across those last 3 fights. A pretty tall order, but not impossible, given how blisteringly fast the circlet allowed them to get. In the High Hall's Gauntlet, the circlet turnarounds would absolutely shred the Choir Clapper's obscene health bars, which were in fact larger on the release patch. The rest of the arena was largely fought normally with the circlet chipping in, given that the Silk Spear's range allows for insane multi-target damage. Still though, about 12 seconds saved here. Pretty good start. Lace in the Cradle was probably the hardest in the bunch, but also the fight where the circlet could do the most played right. With a whopping 1.75x damage scaling on the circlet, each multi-hit would deal about 1/16 of her total health. But one problem, Lace is fast, she's really small, and therefore really hard to get those multi-hits on. Still though, 16 seconds saved here. Then, lastly, Grandmother Silk. Despite only having a 1.1x damage multiplier, she easily got melted the hardest. Given that the multi-hits were essentially free, it was just a question of sticking to the boss and activating the cloak as often as possible. Runners brought this fight down to about 43 seconds, phase change included. So, barely adds up, right? Well, not necessarily. The prospective circlet routes also had to compete with the brand new, incredibly fast cloakless key route early game, where runners skipped the Drifter's Cloak entirely in favor of navigating the wormways to reach the Cling Grid. No Drifter's Cloak, no Circlet. The two routes were completely incompatible with each other. But despite that, it was really, really close to the old Bell route. Even then, it was 15 seconds slower. Even an insanely overpowered build for the last 3 fights of the run couldn't contend with streamlined routing. The key route soared ahead by another 2 minutes or so. A death blow for the prospective circlet route. So, you'd think that was the end of the circlet, right? It certainly seemed so. Naturally, the insane brokenness of the tool was quickly patched, with Team Cherry understandably taking a sledgehammer to it once they found out how broken it was. On the next patch of the game, the damage was reduced from 13 down to 8, the multi-hits were fixed, and the scaling was completely scrapped. It seemed at first glance that they had decided to take the tool out back and shoot it in the head. Temporarily, at least. Because shortly, the third major patch of Silksong released, and along with it, a major Sawtooth Circlet rework and buff. The scaling with the damage multipliers was back, but now the tool's base damage would scale with crafting hits very generously, starting at 9 damage at 0 crafting kits, with the circlet's output going as high as 28 damage for a full arsenal. Still way outscaling Hornet's Needle. The circlet was back, it was extremely powerful, and it was going to come through in a big way in Silksong's longer categories. The recent circlet changes made it so the tool was strongest in routes where you could front-load crafting kits. Even getting 2 or 3 early would make your damage output ridiculously high, especially with the optimized circlet techniques that were quickly developed. On that note, let's go to circlet school, shall we?
Circlet school with Blue Sark.
The main technique that runners use with circlet is the needle float cancel, which is performed by unfurling the Drifter's Cloak, followed by an immediate needle, allowing us to get damage from both sources simultaneously. We can also introduce the fade down cloak into the equation, by doing a similar needle animation cancel on the wings, and then while falling doing the same thing with the cloak, we can pretty much uninterruptedly swing our needle while adding circlets. This is what's called a double, because we circlet twice before landing on the ground again. Then there's what we'll call a triple, which is doing the exact same thing but adding a second Drifter's Cloak activation into the mix. This is really finicky and takes practice, especially as you use the same button for jumping, double jumping, and floating. But done just right, you can hit most targets reliably with a circlet per needle swing at full speed. The height management is the tricky part, but it really helps that most targets you'll be circleting are a lot bigger than Hornet. What does this look like in practice? Well, take a look at this Cogwork Dancers fight. The Hornet on the left with the circlet is able to melt it so much faster. Add this up for pretty much every boss and combat arena in the game, and you see the idea. The circlet saves a lot of time. Additionally, there are also other ways to animation cancel, like down dashing, pogoing, etc. This is the key to getting good with the Sawtooth Circlet. Okay, so crafting kits, huh? How do we get a lot of those early? Well, there's 4 in the game. 1 at Forge Daughter, 1 at Krage at the halfway home for finishing Crawbug clearing, 1 ridiculously expensive one held by Grindel, and 1 purchased from the 12th Architect for 450 rosaries. Given that we want to do the Deep Docks Arena unvoided anyway, routing this Hunter's March rosary string and this Moss Grotto rosary string gives us an easy way to afford Forge Daughter's kit right away. And this one from Krage is gotten from a wish we're required to complete anyway to get into Act 3. So it's a bit of a freebie. These are the 2 kits that all bosses get, putting the circlet's base damage at a whopping 19. Again, with 2 needle upgrades putting us at 13 damage for most of this run, this is way more than doubling our effective damage output. So, with all this in mind, it really should come to no surprise that the Sawtooth Circlet is all over the 100% in all bosses speedruns. Pretty much from the moment it's acquired to the end credits, it's not taken off of Hornet's kit at all. Well, aside from the Abyss Climb. That's just a bad idea. And while the circlet route never came to fruition in any percent, it remains an absolute beast on the latest patch of the game, and honestly, I think its strength really speaks for itself. And if it doesn't to you, then I'll speak for it. I think the sawtooth circlet is pretty cool, and that's why I'm putting it right here on my Silksong tools tier list.